The sun hung low and merciless over the cracked earth of New Mexico territory, painting the desert in shades of burnt orange and dying gold. It was the summer of 1883, a year when the old ways clashed with the new in silent, bloody skirmishes along forgotten trails. Ata rode alone that afternoon, as he had for many seasons since his band scattered after the last big fight with the soldiers. He was past 30 winters now, tall and lean, his dark hair tied back with a strip of rawhide, his face marked by the quiet scars of survival rather than boasting. His pony moved with the careful step of one used to avoiding notice, hooves muffled by dust. Ata carried little: a bow, a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers, a blanket rolled tight, and the weight of memories he preferred not to speak. He had been tracking a stray antelope when the wind shifted, carrying a faint, unnatural scent, sweat, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. He reined in, eyes narrowing toward a line of weathered fence posts that marked the edge of an abandoned homestead claim. The wire had long since rusted and sagged, but one section still stood defiant. There, lashed to the splintered wood with coarse rope, hung a figure that at first glance seemed no more than a discarded bundle of rags. Ata dismounted slowly, approaching on foot so as not to startle whatever lived or died there. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a young woman, no more than 18 summers by the look of her. Her dress, once pale calico, was torn and filthy, streaked with dried blood from cuts on her arms and the cruel chafe of rope around her wrists and ankles. Her head lolled forward, chin resting on her chest, pale hair matted and plastered to her sunburned face. She was alive. He could see the shallow rise and fall of her ribs, but barely. Flies droned around the raw places where the sun had blistered her skin. Ata stood still for a long moment, watching. White men did terrible things to their own kind. He had seen it before. This one had been left as a warning, or perhaps simply forgotten in cruelty. He drew his knife, the blade catching the last light, and stepped forward. The girl stirred at the sound, lifting her head with effort. Her eyes, blue as faded sky, opened wide with terror when she saw him, saw the buckskins, the long dark hair, the copper skin. She tried to speak, but her lips cracked and no sound came. Ata raised one hand, palm out, the universal sign of peace among those who had no common tongue. He cut the ropes at her ankles first, then her wrists. She collapsed forward into the dust, too weak to catch herself. He caught her gently under the arms, easing her down so she would not strike her head. She flinched at his touch, but there was no strength left to fight. Ata wrapped her in his blanket, the wool rough but warm against the cooling evening air. He lifted her as easily as a child, cradling her against his chest, and carried her back to his pony. She weighed almost nothing. He mounted with care, settling her in front of him so she could lean against his frame, then turned the horse toward the low hills where he kept his hidden camp. No one followed. The land was empty for miles in every direction. The cave was not far, a narrow opening in a sandstone bluff, screened by scrub juniper and hidden from casual eyes. Hardis had claimed it years ago after his people moved on. Inside, the air stayed cool even in high summer. A small spring trickled at the back, enough to keep a man alive if he was careful. He laid the girl on a bed of softened hides near the entrance, where the light still reached, and built a small fire with dry twigs that gave off little smoke. The flames flickered low as he boiled water in a tin cup, then steeped mesquite leaves and willow bark to make a tea for pain and fever. She woke fully sometime after dark, eyes darting around the dim space. Ata sat cross-legged a respectful distance away, sharpening an arrowhead with steady strokes. He did not look directly at her. Among his people, staring was an aggression. Instead, he placed the cup of tea near her hand and waited. She stared at it, then at him, suspicion warring with thirst. Finally, she lifted it with trembling fingers and drank. The bitter taste made her grimace, but she finished it. For 3 days, Ata tended her without words, beyond the few he knew in broken English: water, food, rest. He cleaned her wounds with boiled cloth, applied poultices of yucca root to draw out infection, and fed her thin broth made from rabbit he snared nearby. She ate what she could, slept in fits, and watched him always, waiting for the moment he would demand payment for his mercy. But he asked for nothing. He slept outside the cave mouth, wrapped only in his second blanket, rifle close at hand. On the fourth morning she spoke. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from disuse. "Why?" she asked simply. Hatter looked at her then, really looked, seeing past the bruises to the sharp intelligence in her eyes. He pointed to himself. "Atta," he said. Then he gestured to the sky, where an eagle circled high on a thermal. Eagle. Atta means eagle. She swallowed. "Evelyn," she offered in return. "My name is Evelyn." He repeated it carefully. "Evie-Lyn," then shook his head slowly. "Not anymore," he said in his quiet way. He reached for a small leather pouch at his belt and drew out a dried sprig of desert marigold, the kind that bloomed fierce and yellow after a fire swept the land. He held it up. "Yaka," he told her, "the plant that lives after burning, strong, comes back." She stared at the flower, then at him. Tears welled, the first she had shed since the ropes went around her wrists. She did not argue. From that moment, in the silence of the cave, she became Yaka. Atta taught her slowly how to twist grass into cord for snares, how to read the faint prints of deer in sand, how to bank a fire so the smoke rose thin and vanished before it betrayed them. She learned quickly, her hands steadying day by day. In return, she told him fragments of her story in halting whispers when the fire burned low. Her parents dead of fever when she was 12, an uncle who sold her to a saloon in Santa Fe at 15, years of escaping and being dragged back. The last time, the owner had her bound to the fence as punishment, left for the coyotes or the sun. She had prayed for death then. Instead, she found Atta. He listened without judgment, nodding once when she finished. Then he carved a small bone pendant from antler, etched with a simple spiral, the symbol for new life, and strung it on sinew. He placed it around her neck without ceremony. "Protection," he said, "for Yaka." Outside, the desert winds howled, but inside the cave, a fragile trust took root. Atta hunted, Yaka mended, and the days passed in quiet rhythm. She began to walk farther each day, testing her strength, and he walked beside her, never too close, never too far. The loneliness that had shadowed him for so long began to lift, replaced by something unnamed but steady. For the first time in years, the eagle felt the pull of earth as much as sky. Yet the world beyond the hills had not forgotten her. Word traveled slow on the frontier, but it traveled. Men with badges and men without would come looking for the runaway girl with the pale hair. When they did, Atta knew, the quiet peace would shatter. But for now, in the shelter of stone and firelight, Yaka had a name, a place, and for the first time, a reason to believe she might belong somewhere after all. Weeks slipped into months, and the desert seasons turned with their slow, inexorable rhythm. Autumn brought cooler nights, and the first pale gold of rabbit brush along the washes. Winter followed with thin frost that silvered the rocks at dawn. Yaka, no longer Evelyn in her own mind, grew stronger. The hollows in her cheeks filled out, her arms gained the wiry muscle of one who hauled water, scraped hides, and walked long miles beside a sure-footed pony. Atta watched the change without comment, but his silence carried approval. He taught her to shoot his old trade rifle, steadying her elbow until the recoil no longer knocked her backward. She learned to string a bow, though her arrows flew wild at first. Patience, he showed her, was the truest weapon. They spoke more now, piecing together meaning from gestures, shared words, and the language of the land itself. Atta told her stories of his people in low tones, when the fire popped soft sparks into the dark, how the Comanche once rode as lords of the southern plains, how the buffalo herds darkened the horizon like storm clouds, how the soldiers came with repeating rifles and promises written on paper. No one could eat. He spoke of a wife taken by fever long ago, a daughter lost to the same coughing sickness before she saw 3 winters. The words came hard, like stones pulled from deep earth, but Yaka listened without pity or interruption. In return, she gave him pieces of her own past. The smell of her mother's bread rising in a sod house, the crack of her father's whip driving oxen, the night the fever took them both and left her to an uncle who saw only coin in her future. She did not weep when she spoke of the saloon, the hands that grabbed, the nights she stared at the ceiling and prayed for numbness. Ata only nodded once, then rose to add wood to the fire so the light hid whatever crossed his face. Their days settled into patterns that felt almost like family. Ata hunted farther now that Yaka could keep the camp alone. She tanned the hides he brought back, stretching them on frames of cedar, scraping them smooth with a bone tool he carved for her. Together, they gathered piñón nuts in the fall, cracking the shells between stones until their fingers ached and their palms were stained dark. At night they sat apart but close, the space between them comfortable rather than wary. Sometimes Ata sang, old songs in a tongue she did not understand, the notes rising and falling like wind through canyons. Yaka found herself humming the melodies later when she worked alone, the sound surprising her with its steadiness. Trouble arrived with the spring thaw of 1884. A rider appeared one morning on the rim of the distant ridge, silhouetted against a sky the color of new tin. Ata saw him first. He stepped outside the cave mouth, motionless, watching as the horseman scanned the valley below, then turned back the way he had come. That evening Ata spoke more words than usual. "Men, look," he said. "For you." Yaka felt the old fear coil tight in her stomach, but it was smaller now, tempered by months of sun and sweat and quiet trust. "They won't find me easy," she answered. Ata studied her a long moment. "They bring paper, reward, dead or alive." She touched the bone pendant at her throat, the spiral warm from her skin. "Then we make sure they find nothing." They moved the camp 3 days later, deeper into the broken country where canyons folded into one another, like the pages of a closed book. Ata chose a new shelter, a shallow overhang beneath a caprock ledge, screened by piñón and chamisa. Water seeped from a crack in the stone, enough for 2 people and a horse if they were sparing. Yaka helped build a low windbreak of brush and hides, her hands quick and sure. When the work was done, they sat together on a flat boulder that caught the last sun, sharing a strip of jerked venison. The silence between them felt different now, full rather than empty. The hunters came at dusk a week later, 4 of them, riding in loose formation. Ata watched from a high cleft, while Yaka waited below, hidden behind a tumble of boulders, with the rifle across her knees. She had practiced the shot he taught her. Breathe out, hold, squeeze smooth. The men dismounted near the old cave, calling her name, Evelyn, over and over, their voices thin and mocking on the wind. One kicked over the cold fire ring, another laughed when he found the scrap of calico she had once worn. They searched for an hour, found nothing useful, then mounted again and rode west toward the stage road. Ata returned after full dark. "They go," he said, "for now." Yaka lowered the rifle, her hand steady. "They'll come back." He nodded. "Maybe." That night, she could not sleep. She sat by the small fire, feeding it twigs one at a time. Ata sat across from her, sharpening his knife with the same slow rhythm he always used. After a long while she spoke. "I don't want to run forever." He looked up. "I want to stay," she said, "here, with you. Not hiding. Just living." Ata set the knife down. The firelight carved deep shadows across his face. "This land does not belong to one man," he said quietly. "It belongs to those who care for it. You care now. That is enough." She reached across the small flames and touched his hand. Just once, brief as a moth's wing. He did not pull away. In the months that followed, they ventured farther from the overhang. Ata took her to a small band of mixed-blood herders who lived in a shallow valley 20 miles north, people who had drifted away from both reservation and town, raising goats and a few scrub cattle. They spoke Spanish and some English and a little Comanche. They asked no questions beyond whether the strangers could work. Ata bartered 2 good hides and a pouch of piñón nuts for seed corn and an iron pot. Yaka helped the women card wool, her hands learning the rhythm of the spindle. The children called her Yaka without being told. The name spread like dust on wind. They built a small adobe room against the canyon wall, no bigger than needed for sleeping, and a hearth. It had no door at first, only a blanket hung against flies and wind. Ata carved a lintel from cottonwood, etching the same spiral he had given her in bone. When the room was finished, he placed his blanket inside beside hers. Neither spoke of it. Some things did not need words. The bounty men never returned. Word reached the herders that the saloon owner in Santa Fe had been shot dead in a card game. The reward paper blew away with the next wind. Yaka heard the story and felt only a distant relief, like closing a book she no longer needed to read. Years later, 5, perhaps 6, a traveler passing through the valley stopped to water his horse. He was an older man, bearded, with the look of someone who had carried mail or scouted for the army long ago. He saw the woman with pale hair working beside a tall Comanche man, saw the spiral carved above their doorway, saw the quiet way they moved together like two trees that had grown side by side so long their branches touched. He asked no names, only shared coffee and a smoke, then rode on. That night Yaka sat outside the adobe, knees drawn up, watching stars prick the black sky. Ata joined her, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I was lost," she said softly. He waited. "You gave me a name, a place, a life." Ata looked at the stars too. "You were never lost," he said, "only waiting to be found." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not move away. Above them, the eagle circled once on silent wings, then tilted toward the moon and was gone. In the canyon below, a goat bleated, a child laughed, a fire glowed small and steady. The desert stretched on forever, vast and indifferent, but here, in this one small pocket of stone and earth, two people who had been broken by different worlds had built something whole. Not a grand story, not a legend, just a life, quiet and chosen, under the same endless sky.